Hi, this is Cosmin with Freebird Media. We're sitting here today with Stephen Woodworth, a former MP of Kitchener Centre from 2008 till 2015.
That's correct.
And the director of the Democracy Defence Initiative, and we'll be asking some questions on what that exactly is and where we're going to move forward in the next year. So, Stephen, to start things off, I'd like to ask the question if you believe that democracy is under attack today in Canada.
You know, I would make an even stronger statement than that. I think that democracy has been largely displaced in Canada today. Our governments at all levels have been occupied by people who care nothing whatsoever for democracy. And a lot of our democratic institutions are falling by the wayside even as we speak. The only thing that really we've managed to retain is the notion of free elections every 4 years. But if you look at the manner in which our governments operate, our legislatures in fact are no longer independent of the executive branch. Our judicial branch has taken over a lot of the legislative authority that we used to repose in our elected representatives. We have people who are using, or I should say abusing, positions of power in order to sweep aside basic freedoms that Canadians have enjoyed for hundreds of years. It's really a crisis situation, and what makes it very peculiar is that most Canadians are not aware that these things are happening.
So could you cite some examples that illustrate this movement towards a more centralized power and towards a more kind of authoritarian grasp on people's freedoms?
Sure. So, for example, you know what a big row it caused in Canada during the Great Wars when we introduced conscription. In the middle of that, we always allowed that people who were conscripted to defend the country in times of crisis, when the very existence of Canada was at stake, we always allowed people to opt out of any deliberate taking of life or even participating in anything that would indirectly take life. Now, here in 2017, almost 2018, we have regulations which penalize honorable men and women in the medical professions if, for reasons of conscience, they don't wish to materially cooperate in arranging the deaths of others. Those doctors and pharmacists and other good citizens are not even given the right of conscientious objection that we have previously given to conscripted soldiers in times of national crisis. This is a fundamental violation of a basic freedom guaranteed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is freedom of conscience. It's shameful that it's happening in Canada today. It's shameful that even anyone would suggest it in Canada today. And yet, it's the law. We have to do something about that.
So for something like the medical profession, how is it that such a political kind of perspective is kind of breeding into it and has infiltrated something that is in the professional?
Well, I think it's an age-old problem, and I think it was, I don't know if it was Denning or Atkins who came up with the saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. What we have in this case is that a dynamic where people are simply exercising power. They're simply enforcing their will to quash the will of others. And this is an age-old human challenge, and we need to be eternally vigilant to push back on it. To say, no, that's not right, that we should have freedom of belief, we should have freedom of speech, we should have freedom of conscience, freedom of association. And we're not doing that in Canada. What we are doing is having resort to the courts, but you know what? The courts are just another branch of government. It's not appropriate that a free citizen should have to plead before a court for their freedom. It's up to citizens to ensure their freedom through their elected representatives, and we're failing to do that in Canada.
So the scale and the scope of the Democracy Defence Initiative is essentially a national one. It's not just localized to Ontario or you know, the eastern provinces. It's something that affects the entire country.
That is correct. And in fact, our board of directors is a national board, although I regret to say I haven't gotten out to the East Coast yet, right. But we have directors from British Columbia and Alberta and Ontario, and the intention is to try to address these problems at a national level on a non-partisan basis, on a non-denominational basis. We are open to anyone who is concerned about freedom and democracy in Canada. I don't care what your religion is, or if you have no religion at all, or what your political affiliation is, or if you have no political affiliation. If you want to do something to ensure that Canada remains a free democracy, then we need you.
Okay, so in terms of the pragmatics of the Democracy Defence Initiative, or DDI, how does it work? What is the organizational structure? Is it grassroots? Is it localized? Like you said, it's also national, so there's a national board of members. So what are the logistics? The logistics of it.
Well, we actually, because we are a young organization, we don't have a very rigid membership structure. I have a list, I guess, of interested stakeholders of hundreds of people across the country who I keep informed about our activity and about the challenges that Canada is facing. I have, as I mentioned, a board of directors of roughly 6 or 9 people. It fluctuates from time to time. We have founded our first local chapter in Waterloo region, which has a board of its own and which I hope will be able to act independently of our national group. In a way, you could say that what we're attempting to do is establish a non-partisan political party. Because everything that we do is exactly what political parties do. Yeah. We put up signs, we put out flyers, we put up a tent if we can at a local community festival. We try to get our message out, we try to inform people and motivate them. Yeah. We try to get them to vote for freedom and democracy rather than as a regular political party would do, to vote for that party.
Right, so that actually leads into my next question. And does DDI intend to act exclusively in political activities as a watchdog activist group, as distinct from areas like legal or academic domain?
That's correct. In fact, there are a number of groups across Canada who are challenging authoritarian rules in the courts, and they do some excellent work. The Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedom, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, and of course those whose freedom has been taken away from them, they also respond by going to court. But as I mentioned earlier, in my view, it is our elected representatives who are responsible for preserving Canadian freedom. Yeah. And as long as they're sitting on the sidelines, as long as they're not motivated, then we don't know what the court will do. Right. What will happen, for example, if the Supreme Court of Canada rules against religious freedom in the Trinity Western University case? What will happen if the Supreme Court of Canada rules that Canadians are no longer free to choose their own religious beliefs or to associate in churches with people who share their religious beliefs? If they penalize a church or an individual for having a different religious belief than the authorities, what will happen if the Supreme Court of Canada lets that slip, as the Ontario Court of Appeal did? Then where will we go? And the answer is that it's up to us as free citizens to demand that we remain free. And we ought not to accept the decision of any court which strips us of freedoms that have been developing over the last 1,000 years.
So in the greater context of things, Stephen, can you give me a bit of historical perspective on these freedom issues?
Exactly, yes, I can. And I like to remind people that every November 11th we get together and we very solemnly praise those who came before us for fighting and sacrificing and dying to preserve our freedom. In my case, my father enlisted during the Second War to go and fight against regimes which were imposing on people's freedom, which were oppressing others. So how do we honor those who came before us? We don't honor them by sitting back and letting our own governments be taken over by authoritarians who want to oppress others, who want to impose their beliefs and who want to do away with freedom of conscience. In Canada, you know, we have a reflex to talk about the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but you know what, that was only enacted in 1981, 82, 83, and our freedoms in Canada existed long before that. We've had the ability to conscientiously object to causing death since the 1790s, in fact. We've had freedom of speech for a long time. We've had freedom of belief for a long time, long before the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so we can't rely simply on the Canadian Charter for the protection of those freedoms. We have to go back to our roots. You know, I have many friends from Eastern Europe. They came to Canada to escape the kind of totalitarian dictatorship which imposed belief systems on all citizens. It would be a shock to them to know that the Law Society in Ontario now requires lawyers to sign a belief statement to say that they believe the same things that the governors of the Law Society believe in order to be able to practice law. That's not a Canadian way. That's anti-democratic. Something has to be done about it, and it's up to our elected representatives. You know, there was a poet in World War II who came face to face with this issue. How do we motivate people to fight for freedom? His name was Martin Niemöller. He was also a Lutheran pastor, but a poet in this case. And he came up with that very well-known poem. You know, first they came for the communists and I said nothing. Then they came for the socialists and I said nothing. Then they came for the trade unionists and I said nothing. Then they came for the teachers and I said nothing. Then they came for my neighbor and I said nothing. And then they came for me and there was no one left to say anything. We have to make people understand that the sacrifices that their fathers and uncles fought for, the life that many of our Canadians left behind in totalitarian regimes, those kinds of things are now arising in Canada. And it'll come to their doorstep unless they do something about it now.
Yeah, and that really resounds to me coming from a post-communist country. And now that I see things like forced speech or forced action that is backed by a political mandate, it's just beyond me that can happen in a country. And from fleeing from somewhere else and then finding the exact same thing here is disheartening.
Correct. Right? It's terrible. And you know what? Among other things, freedom of belief is under threat in Canada. Who would have ever thought that you could be denied the right to adopt a child because of your peaceful beliefs? And yet there is a case right now of that in British Columbia. Who would have ever thought that the government could order a religious school not to teach certain of the group's religious scriptures in its schools to its children? Who would have thought, in fact, after what happened with the Aboriginal residential schools in Canada, who would have thought that any government would try to alienate children through the education system from the cultural beliefs of their parents? And yet that's exactly what's happening in Ontario and in British Columbia and soon to come in Alberta and elsewhere across Canada. People have to sit up and realize that in Canada we appear to no longer value diversity. If you don't go along with the authorities, to heck with diversity, you'll be squashed. We no longer value freedom. If you want the freedom to choose your own beliefs or to follow your own conscience, too bad, the authorities can order you otherwise. So That is where we're at today, and we need to act politically to reverse that trend.
Just to bring things back to the specifics of the Democracy Defense Initiative, the first guiding principle listed on your website, and I'm quoting this directly, is, "We will defend freedom from the constraints of civil authorities, not freedoms to demand from others."
Correct.
So could you further expand on the differences between freedom from constraints and then freedom to demand?
Absolutely. In fact, freedom is one of those words which only expresses a partial thought. It's a great rallying cry, freedom, but what does it mean? Until you speak in more detail, you can't tell what freedom means, just as with equality. That's a great rallying cry, but what does equality mean? Is it equality of outcome, equality of opportunity, equality between men and women? In relation to freedom, there are a great many things which are good for society. For example, the idea that we should all have a roof over our head. But because something is a social good doesn't necessarily mean that you should be free to demand it. The language has been used, and in a way it takes us away from the real meaning of freedom. So we can say that we should have freedom to have affordable housing, or freedom to have clean drinking water. Both very worthwhile social goods, but not really to do with freedom, because that amounts to a freedom to demand that someone gives you something. What we're concerned about is freedom in a more fundamental sense, that is the freedom to pursue our own dreams, our own hopes, our own aspirations, to look after our own family and raise our children the way we feel that they should be raised, without the government or someone else ordering us to do what they want to do. That's the kind of freedom that we're concerned about.
Now, to address a more local issue, we at Freebird Media were on the ground here in Waterloo, more specifically at Laurier, during the whole Lindsay Shepherd controversy. So although that incident took place within the bounds of academia, and DDI is more interested in political questions, do you think that it is indicative of a larger social problem that is actually at the root of society, or
It is indicative of the authoritarian mentality that seems to possess the people who occupy public power in Canada. And I would have to say that a university is not simply an academic setting. A university is in effect publicly funded. It's a branch of the government with only delegated authority in some respects. So when the university is taking government money, they are obliged to use it according to certain rules. They are not allowed, or ought not to be allowed, to use it to impose their authority on others in a way which is inconsistent with our tradition of freedom. So what happened in the case of Lindsay Shepherd is that there were rules applied which have the effect of telling people what they can or cannot believe, what they can or cannot say, and those involved in exercising authority, public authority over Lindsay Shepherd, abused their position in order to penalize her for free thinking and free speech. And that just shouldn't happen in Canada. It really is a shameful, sad situation, and it's not exclusive to that campus. It happens on other campuses across Canada. So for example, a pro-life group in Alberta was required to pay a penalty of $17,000 in order to participate in a public event of student activities and interests on a campus. And they were required to do that ostensibly as a security fee because others had threatened violence against them if they were to attend. But in effect, what happened is that their voice was simply shut down on that campus. And in a public institution with public authority involved, that shouldn't be allowed to happen.
We can take another quick break. Great. So, Stephen, an increasing amount of Canadians express a disinterest in political dialogue and political issues. Often people are comfortable with just letting the government take care of things, and they don't really pay attention to it at all. So how can a group like DDI hope to motivate people in informing them on these issues?
It's an excellent question, and I don't pretend to have all of the answers, but I know that there are certain basic steps that we can approach. The first is, in fact, just to inform people. So many people are living their lives and are insulated from the news of what is actually happening to others across the country. So we have to first of all be very loud and noisy and visible in raising the alarm with our friends and neighbors. That's step one. It's absolutely essential. Step two involves somehow reaching into people's hearts and really getting them to care about what's happening. Now, people care about their own lives. So in a case where their own freedom has been limited or taken away or oppressed, if they're not aware of it, becoming aware of it may be all that's needed to motivate them. The real challenge is in motivating people to care about their neighbors, to care about what's happening to the fellow down the road, to care about what's happening to somebody in a different church than they're in, simply because it's wrong for the country. And that's a sense of idealism that I believe is found within the heart of every man and woman. But we need poets and we need passionate eloquence to bring it out of people in order to get them to invest some of their own time, treasure, and effort in rolling back the inroads that authoritarians have made in Canada.
So, like you quoted that poet earlier, it's essentially people won't care until it comes to their doorstep, but we have to find a way to get them to realize that this matters before that, because then it's too late, like you said.
Yeah, it would be too bleak of you to say that people won't care, but it is true to say that it's human nature to be concerned first about one's own circle. So we need to get people to look up from their own circle and survey the wider landscape and to understand that what happens out there does affect them here. You know, John Donne said it best, don't ask for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Every man's death diminishes me. In the same way, freedom should be like the very air that we breathe. And if it's fouled by oppression against a person over here, that's going to smell up my own house too. And we have to get people to think in that kind of relational way. And by the way, we are opposed in this. That's what makes it even worse. The people who are out there imposing their own views are the very first people to say things like diversity is our strength. They make it sound as if they're trying to protect freedom when in fact they're doing the exact opposite. You know, the people who call themselves Antifa, they're the ones running around with baseball bats trying to shut down their opponents from having any ability to speak publicly. And so we have to realize, in fact, that some of our opponents will, in fact, take up baseball bats and smash cars and slash tires, or at the very least spit at people or hurl curses at them. And you know what? It takes a degree of commitment and fortitude to stand up to that and to say, no, I'm here to protect the freedom of my family and my children and my children's children and my neighbors. We need to ask people to reach deep within themselves to find that fortitude.
To speak more on the opposition, a lot of people would accuse DDI of being bipartisan and primarily conservative. How would you respond to these detractors?
Well, in fact, one of the tools that our opponents use is a kind of factionalism, by which I mean they like to divide people up into groups, and you're either with us or against us. In terms that a university graduate of philosophy and logic would understand, this is a kind of an ad hominem fallacy. To say, look, it doesn't matter what this fellow says, because he's not with us, we're not going to agree with it. And it's a totally illogical and unhelpful thing in a democracy. I used to say to people that if Attila the Hun came up to me with an idea for world peace that seemed like it made sense, I wouldn't care if it was Attila the Hun who thought of it. If it made sense for world peace, I'd back it all the way. And so what we need to do is to keep people focused on the issues. I sometimes try to convince people that actually freedom and democracy are small L liberal values. But you know what, in Canada today, if you are fighting for freedom and democracy, if you're fighting for the recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of every member of the human family, if you're pursuing those ideals in Canada, you're called a conservative. Now, those are the ideals that my father went to war for. Those are the ideals that were framed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And because I support them, there are those who want to put a label on it as conservative. Eventually, you know what I've come up with? I've said I don't care whether it's a liberal idea or a conservative idea, as long as it's the right idea. And that's what we have to ask people to do, is forget labels, forget identity groups, forget us against them, and think about what makes sense and what's best for Canada and for our citizens.
It's really great to hear, Stephen. Now, for the average citizen, for the average Joe at home who feels his or her rights are being threatened by an increasingly larger and more authoritarian government, what can they do? Like, how do they get involved on the ground, either in DDI or otherwise?
Sure. And in fact, if you think about this in the same way that you would any other political issue, you can see that there is a continuum of effort that people can apply. And I can tell you from experience that signing in and sending a postcard to an elected representative hardly registers. Maybe if they got 10,000 of them, it might register. I knew a member of Parliament once who got 3,000 postcards on an issue from her riding and still voted differently than what her constituents on those postcards wanted her to do. So postcards are the easiest thing to do. Online petitions are easy to do. You can bump that up a notch, and you can say, I'm going to write a handwritten letter. That'll get a little bit more attention from your elected representative. Or, even better, you can telephone and at least leave a message. If your member of Parliament doesn't talk to people, that may be all you can do, but if you're real lucky, you'll be able to talk to your member of Parliament or make an appointment to go in and see your elected representative. Here's the bottom line. Elected people have what they call the election question. And that is the question that will actually change your vote. And you know what? You can care about an issue, but if they don't think you care enough to change your vote, they're not going to really care about it. I know this because I've dealt with many members of Parliament. Now, I shouldn't say this in too broad a brush. There are some members of Parliament who do take a more principled approach. But many members of Parliament, many elected representatives at all levels, are mostly worried about getting re-elected or getting elected in the first place. And they have to. That's ordinary, natural thinking. So what you have to do is show them that you care enough about it that it's going to change your vote. That if they don't do something about this, you're not going to vote for them. You're going to vote for somebody else. It's the ballot box question. And the more effort you put into it, the better. And ultimately, I'd like to see people out on the streets. You know, there's a group in Toronto that doesn't like the fur industry. Every weekend, through all of last winter, they came out in the cold and the snow and the slush, and they picketed in front of a store that sold furs. And you know what? That says they care. And that gives their word weight. And unfortunately, we have to do the same kinds of things if we are trying to defend freedom and democracy in Canada today.
Well, Stephen, we'd like to thank you for your time and taking it out of your day to talk to us. And for our audience out there, you could actually check out the Democracy Defense Initiative website, which will provide a link below. And just to learn more about Stephen and what he's doing